Since the turn of the 21st century, timbre has emerged as an important research topic in various music disciplines. This has been demonstrated through the creation of the International Multi-Institution Actor Project, societal special interest groups, three iterations of a timbre summer school, specialized academic conferences, two seasons of an Afrological timbre speaker series, and a noticeable uptick in publications with a timbral focus. As this research topic becomes more ubiquitous, so too do the most pervasive timbral talking points. The characteristic global scope of ethnomusicology challenges some of these conventional claims that timbre scholars make, while also presenting ethnomusicologists with numerous issues. While ultimately embracing the global study of timbre, in this presentation, I consider some of these practical and theoretical quandaries, ruminate on their implications, and advise those looking to navigate this academic inquiry. Many studies of timbre start with an acknowledgement that it is difficult to discuss and that we lack a vocabulary for this purpose. This is part of what Emily Dolan labels the timbral litany. Consider this representative example from one of the most influential scholars of timbre, Cornelia Fales. As scholars, indeed as listeners, we have a difficult time describing timbre. Though we can talk about it in large generalities, as though it were a conceptual abstraction. Timbre is important to African music. Community is important to African music. It is only by deliberate effort that we can conceptualize it as a distinctly ongoing, dynamic feature of music, with the same clarity as pitch or meter. We hear timbre, we use it. No one has much trouble telling instruments apart, but we have no language to describe it. Much of the literature attributes these challenges in discourse to the fact that timbre is a multidimensional perceptual quality, while other parameters, such as loudness and pitch, are syntactic, discrete, proportionally related, and, thus, easier to quantify. I also suggest that this alleged difficulty is due to an absence of the word timbre in many languages, as well as numerous cultures' tendency to discuss the parameter in conjunction with other facets of sound. Luvale musicians in Zambia, Angola, and the DRC do not have a word that directly translates to timbre. But as I have previously argued, this does not equate to a lack of a Luvale timbral sensibility. In the first of several parallels to African rhythm in this presentation, I cite Kofi Agawu and Meki Nzewi. They remind us that although many African languages do not contain a word that directly translates to rhythm, this is not proof of an African inability to conceptualize this European term. Evidence of African rhythmic conceptualization, they state, is in performance practice as well as less explicitly rhythmic vocabulary. Andile Kumalo similarly asserts that Amashosa musicians are conscious of and value timbre despite not using, quote, the language of partials and overtones, end quote. These cultures have their own methods with which they can discuss the parameter. These methods, however, do not always deal with timbre in isolation. The lack of a Luvale word for timbre may reflect its intertwining with additional dimensions of sound. McAdams, Goodchild, and Sullivan remind us that timbre co-varies with sonic and performance components, such as pitch, playing effort, dynamics, and articulation. As such, they argue that timbre cannot be considered independently. Fales similarly asserts that timbre is tied to other sonic parameters, and truly isolating these, even just for analytical purposes, is impossible. Examples from across the globe support these statements, as numerous cultures discuss timbre in conjunction with other facets of sound. Ruth Stone demonstrated how Capel musical terminology simultaneously addresses timbral and non-timbral attributes, such as pitch or dynamics. Jane Sugarman similarly notes how Prespa Albanians often distinguished gendered voices through descriptive terms that encapsulate timbre, tessitura, and technique. Let us also consider mnemonic devices, which are capable of communicating timbral detail down to the individual note. Gerard Kubik discusses how drum mnemonic syllables across West and Central Africa convey timbral detail along with information on rhythmic position, accentuation, and technique. Balinese vocables communicate drum timbre, the size of the drum, and whether the stroke is played with a mallet or not. In Korean yukbo, uh, e. and Korean yukbo similar vocables similarly represent timbre, technique, metrical position, and duration, while dictating the instrument of performance. Rather than indexing a semantic failure, I argue that this linguistic multidimensionality is representative of a more holistic understanding of timbre and its role within a sonic gestalt. Put another way, some cultures' words for timbre are so rich that they can also discuss other aspects of sound. So, do we really lack a language with which we can describe timbre? As I have demonstrated throughout my doctoral dissertation, Luvali practitioners have little trouble discussing the vocal timbre of ancestral spirits and drums. Their ability to do so is powerful enough to distinguish a large pantheon of vocalizing spirits through timbre and aid the fine-tuning of instruments. They are also equally able to discuss processes that rely on timbral control, evincing an emic timbral theory. But the Luvale are not unique in their ability to describe timbre. Throughout our planet, musicians speak of timbre in a way that counters Dolan's timbral litany. In his analysis of terms used by Bulgarian folk musicians, Timothy Rice notes that singers speak at length about vocal quality. In this discourse, there are two timbral categories. Quote, the clean, chist, reedy, piscleve group, or the muddy, muten, buttery, majin group. End quote. In Korean pansori, vocal production is divided into types by timbre. Quote, Suryeseong, a rough but resonant voice, Choseong, a voice sounding like hard iron, and Jeongguseong, a gifted voice with a bright and clear sound. End quote. And various styles of Tuvan music are governed by a robust timbral lexicon. Descriptive tactics in this tradition include onomatopoetic idiophones, cross-modal adjectives, articulatory phonetics, and affective terms. Considering the preceding points, I therefore propose that we abandon the ubiquitous primer of a sonic parameter plagued by linguistic shortcomings. Instead, we should recognize and champion the different vocabularies and methods practitioners use to discuss timbre and all else its description reveals. Acknowledging that there is already ample language in various traditions to describe timbre, what, then, of the new terms scholars create for this purpose? Here I provide just a sampling of the terminology scholars have recently coined to analyze timbre. What does the presence of such a rich academic vocabulary for timbre indicate? In his commentary on the academic study of African music, Kofi Agawu lists no less than 38 terms scholars have created to describe African rhythm. Rather than evincing an elevated scholarly discourse on rhythm, he presents this plethora of terms as proof that academics lack a common practice when tackling this aspect of music. In my list alone, I present over a dozen terms scholars, including myself, have similarly created for the study of timbre in just the last 25 years. One of these, timbre juxtaposition, is even independently proposed by different scholars with distinctive definitions. Is timbre, then, already on its way towards a similar absence of common practice? A group of popular music scholars published their review of the first international conference on timbre. Though they applauded the ambition and intention of the conference, as well as a handful of talks and posters, the review is otherwise a strong critique of the meeting. One of the largest points of contention concerns the timbre terminology scholars from different disciplines employed in their analysis of this parameter. At its best, this terminological diversity yielded a productive unruliness that gives timbre its characteristic charm. At its worst, this was viewed as a barrier that confused and alienated many. They ultimately concluded that it prevented the interdisciplinarity the conference was designed to facilitate. It would thus seem that the vast lexicon scholars use may indeed be indicative indicative of an absent common practice in timbre scholarship. Now, since that conference, scholars have admittedly put significant effort into addressing this terminological conundrum. The Actor Project's Timbre and Orchestration resource contains numerous writings and short videos that define and explicate many of the terms used in the academic study and creative use of timbre. While many modules throughout the tour are useful, the EduFilms, Timbre Lingo series, and Learn About Timbre platform are particularly effective at explaining academic timbral terminology. Designed for both scholars from different disciplines as well as general readerships, these resources are a genuine step in the right direction towards terminological clarity. In addition to navigating academic timbre terms within and across different disciplines, scholars should also consider how the concepts they create relate to emic discourse of the traditions they study. As Stephen Blum astutely notes, times have changed, and ethnomusicologists can no longer presume to be theorizing about people who do not themselves theorize. End quote. Indeed, musicians across the globe describe and theorize about timbre within their own languages. Thus, any culture-specific study of the parameter can utilize at least two lexicons, the indigenous and the analytical etic. I suggest that we should place these two lexicons in conversation with each other rather than merely trying to translate the former into the latter. Not only would so much get lost in that type of translation, but it would also represent an attempt to supplant indigenous ways of thinking. However, as Agawu and Diaz passionately contend, we must be wary of going too hard in the other direction and creating problematic timbral ethnotheories. One way of avoiding this is by explicating indigenous conceptualization in a manner that allows for cross-cultural analysis. For it is at the juncture of these two lexicons that we can locate a nuanced sameness rather than difference. For example, Cornelia Fail's combination of emic terminology and her own analytical concepts does not present the Barundi Inanga tradition as fundamentally different than any others. Instead, she joins the two vocabularies to make larger observations about timbre that are informed by that culture, yet can apply to others. She educates readers about the intricacies of the Burundi tradition while also providing tools for uncovering sameness elsewhere. Failure to do so would not only paint Burundi conceptions of this parameter as intrinsically beyond the grasp of Western thought, but also consequentially runs the risk of inventing a Burundi timbre. Agawu has convincingly argued that scholars' excessive attention to a single parameter, rhythm, within African music has had at least two negative consequences. One, African musicians and even the general African populace are othered from all other musicians through rhythmic superiority. And two, African music is essentialized as predominantly rhythmic. In turn, melody, harmony, and other components are overlooked or regarded as primitive. He labels this state of research and general discourse the invention of African rhythm. Indeed, excessive prioritization of a single parameter is not without its ramifications. I wonder, then, does a specifically timbral study of a tradition run the risk of similarly othering certain demographics or reducing entire music systems? Due to the significant amount of research dedicated to timbre in overtone or throat singing and related practices, I wonder if we have already invented Tuvan and Mongolian timbres. Has academia already painted Tuvans as fundamentally different from all other musicians because of a perceived timbral superiority? The musical literature for this culture is saturated with discussions of harmonics, unique vocal timbres, and the ability to connect with landscape through tone. Have we reduced their music to a solely timbral phenomenon? Perhaps these are the wrong questions to ask. What if prioritizing timbre and all its musical and cultural potential is the emic goal? Is drawing academic attention to this the same as inventing a certain culture's timbre? As questions that are probably case specific, I do not propose any answers to them. But I do hope that acknowledging and wrestling with these questions can help us avoid missteps in future academic endeavors. Although some cultures may intentionally exploit timbre's potential, and certain traditions present naturally fertile ground for its academic inquiry, timbre does exist in all musics. So, what of the omnipresence of timbre? Every sound, whether featured in music or not, has a timbre. This has led some to frame timbre as what a sound is, while other parameters, such as loudness and pitch, are what people can do with sound. While the absence of specific types of temporal periodicity may create unmetered music, and other styles are intentionally crafted to be atonal, there cannot be an untimbred or atimbral music. Even music that only includes one timbre, and as such may rely more on the exploitation of other parameters, still has timbre, and likely has preferences regarding its use. To make this point, let us briefly consider lullabies. In many cultures, these songs are frequently performed by a solo, unaccompanied voice. Despite being the only instrument present, this voice, and thus the lullaby, still has a timbre. Though each singer will imprint the lullaby with their own timbral fingerprint, a result of the individual physiology and the habits of the vocalizer, most lullaby performers still adopt a similar timbral archetype, one that is hushed, soft, gentle, and calming. Scholars have even drawn attention to this universal lullaby timbre. One must only imagine screaming a lullaby at a baby with a death metal growl to realize how endemic the soothing timbral aesthetic is. Formal music education is not a part of most lullaby performers' backgrounds, yet the singers still learn these timbral preferences. Ideal lullaby timbral aesthetics are discovered through trial and error, imitation, common sense, instinct, and parental intuition. This brief aside demonstrates how even a monotimbral genre, whether transmitted formally or not, will likely carry with it timbral preferences, and that the ubiquitous lullaby is usually just one of many styles of musicking within a single culture, each with their own implicit or explicit timbral expectations, suggests that every culture has its own system of beliefs and practices about timbre. Our planet is thus full of timbre and schools of thought surrounding its use. It is both exciting and honestly humbling to reflect on the reality that music scholars have barely scratched the surface of these worlds. Though this is no doubt at least somewhat a result of the impossibility of comprehensive global coverage, I posit that our current position is also due to a focus on the timbrally outstanding. Books dedicated to the orchestral gestures of great Western art composers, work commissioned to push the boundaries of extended technique, publications on the extreme tones of death metal, study of artists whose vocal timbres perplex audiences, ethnographic analysis of cultures who prioritize timbre, and an essay series on amazing moments in timbre. These all highlight artists and musics that scholars consider exceptional in their use of timbre. But this agenda overlooks the ordinary moments in timbre. This is unfortunate not only because those moments are still timbral, but also because those are some of the most prevalent instances of timbral thought, creation, listening, and evaluation. Furthermore, analysis of these regular moments in timbre may help us better understand the moments we mark as amazing. But these commonplace moments in timbre are also worthy of study for their own sake. We need not research the tone of a middle-of-the-line acoustic guitar solely to better appreciate the instantly recognizable timbre of virtuosos like John Scofield or Carlos Santana. Due to the prevalence of hobby musicians who strum Oasis songs on unamplified guitars in their bedrooms, these unmarked tone colors are the most familiar timbres to many. Let us celebrate them. These are the timbres of cultures, and for at least that reason, they are deserving of our scholarly attention. From the commonplace to the amazing, lullabies to death metal, Zambia to tuva, and everything in between, any timbre can be a worthwhile study topic. But in our academic endeavors, I recommend embracing a less rigid definition of timbre terminology and expanding what we consider timbral theory. This will allow us to recognize the rich, detailed, and oftentimes sonically holistic ways of discussing the parameter that are already globally prevalent in indigenous practice and discourse. And when carefully placed in conversation with analytic terminology of scholars, it is my hope that the result is not the creation of a timbral ethnotheory, nor the invention of any culture's timbre, but rather the facilitation of cross-cultural work and interdisciplinarity. And while I have posed more questions in this presentation than I've answered, this feels appropriate for a global perspective on the omnipresent parameter of timbre. Thank you.